Joining us tonight is Dr. Steve Pieczenik. He's one of the world's most experienced international crisis negotiators and hostage negotiators. He's worked for over 20 years in this field for over 5 U.S. administrations. And of course, he's worked with Tom Clancy on a couple of book series, the Tom Clancy Ops Center and NetForce book series. We want to talk to him tonight about his take on the Edward Snowden documents, what he believes is behind this as someone experienced in the intelligence community, as well as what he thinks is going on in the Ukraine. Welcome, Dr. Pieczenik. What's foremost on your mind tonight?
Well, let me tell you what I think would be relevant for both our answers. Number one is Snowden and what it really means in terms of intelligence and the amount of money that we're paying for it, which is $60 billion, and why Snowden is very similar to Ellsberg from the blog that I wrote. The second thing that we can talk about is, in fact, what constitutes the change in government, why we are, in many ways, in a military coup, and what's been happening all over the world, because in Thailand there's a coup, in Pakistan there's a coup, there's going to be a coup as well, and Egypt was a military coup. And why is America not having a military coup? Well, we do, because every legislative area is under military control. So what does that mean in light of the Snowden and in light of everything else that we're talking about? What I'm basically saying throughout all of this from my experience is that we have a whole phenomenon going on that has nothing to do with the national security or the legitimacy of the United States, and that's the military and the industrial complex playing around at the expense of the American public. So it's draining out $60 billion or $150 billion, depending on how much you count the appropriations, because now we're beginning to falter as a superpower. On the one hand, we have the superpower position, but we're not. The other thing that's very major for us, I would talk about two of them. One is the position in the Middle East, why we had to get out, and why today we had problems in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we didn't plan to have those consequences of war, the collateral damage. In other words, we went into two countries that we had no right to go in as a result of the incompetency of our presidency. So what I want to get at is that we have had for over 40 years, Republican or Democrats, really incompetent presidents who have not really understood of war, the nature of financial restitution, and the nature of what it is that we Americans need to have, which is prosperity, entrepreneurship, and a middle class. It has nothing to do with being Republican or Democrat. In turn, we have wasted our resources into the Middle East, and now we're shifting into a far more dangerous area. That's why Silicon Valley is secondary to me, although it may be primary to you, and that is China and Japan, where there really can be conflict over the Spratly Islands, over oil, and why we're shifting, and why, again, we don't necessarily have a basic interest. It begins into the nature of, it really gets into the nature of what is America right now, and does it have relevancy to its political system? And the answer is no. Yeah,
you wrote in your blog, that's a very good point. You wrote in your blog that the relevance of the intelligence community is much like the military. It's relevant only to itself. You said our military has no need for the U.S., the U.S. has no need for the military, and it's the same way with the civilian military intelligence community.
And that's what they feel. They've been very clear to me and to others that since they went to war and we had no support for the military whatsoever, which we haven't. Now remember, we haven't had support for our military since 1940s. Our war in Korea was a disaster. The Vietnam War was a disaster. The Iraq wars were a disaster. Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan. So what does the military say? Forget it. We'll just go to anywhere we want. We'll create wars, even with, the president, who may not be CIA, but he is. And we'll just create drone attacks. And most people don't care.
That's right.
Most people aren't relevant. So what I'm saying is, we have a major disintegration of our institutions that is primarily represented by the military, the intelligence community, which constitutes a major part of our budget, because we're in 732 bases in 234 countries. We don't have that many terrorists. So we really have begun to start to disintegrate internally and externally. But we need it's a moment of hope. Actually, the guys like you, the alternative media, has really preempted modern-day media or the mainstay media, where you have guys like Anderson Cooper, we can talk about, who was really, an intern at the CIA a couple of years in a row. But he's CIA. That's why he was fed this. This is not conspiracy. I mean, I've been in the business. I oversaw the CIA. I oversaw National Reconnaissance Organization. I oversaw all of them without belonging to them, but being their bosses, so to speak, because they had to report to a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. What that means is we are the ones who implement policy. We're the ones who create the initiatives that go overseas. In my particular case, I just dismissed the CIA for 30 years because they were incompetent. The only time they were competent was when Jimmy Carter fired over 4,000 CIA operatives. He was the first man only, and he was military. So not only did we have an inherent tension between the military and the civilians, but we'd had this ongoing war where they're becoming less and less reliable. And that's why the agencies have become more reliable, and they're drawing away our minds.
Let me ask you about the Snowden leaks. Now, he's been accused by the U.S. of being a Russian spy, a Chinese spy. I don't think too many people buy that line, but there are people who question whether this is a limited hangout or if he's a genuine whistleblower. You have a different take on this. Tell us what your take is on the Ed Snowden document.
Yeah, sure. You want me to tell you? Or
go ahead.
Yeah. Well, basically, let me go back to the history of Putin and Russia. Having been mainly involved in the takedown of the Soviet Union, I was sent to the Rand Corporation specifically to develop the architecture for the psychological warfare of taking down the Soviet Union. It wasn't done by the CIA. It wasn't done by Mikhail Gorbachev. I'm not the only one, but I was one of the few who could delineate the architecture because I was trained in both political science and in psychiatry, and I'd worked in the Soviet Union over 10 years during the 70s under Nixon and Ford and Reagan to take out political dissidents in psychiatric hospitals. So I had a very good idea where the weaknesses were. And I knew the KGB very well and the GRU. So when we took down the Soviet Union, we in fact made a mistake. We gave it to Yeltsin. Yeltsin was misread. I must admit, I may have been part of that. I don't remember Yeltsin as well as I should have, but he ended up to be a drunk. But I do remember we reconstituted our attempts and put in Gorbachev. And Gorbachev, I thought, that's the one we were working with very strongly. We first had Gorbachev where we took down, and then Yeltsin came in. I'm sorry. We worked against Gorbachev. Then Yeltsin came in, and Yeltsin turned out to be an alcoholic. And I was no longer in the government, but I had some input to say, look, this is not good. Russia has to reconstitute itself. We cannot have a sense of chaos in 122 different federations, which is really what Russia was. And instead, we had a guy named Putin. Putin didn't come up because he was a good guy, a bad guy. He's put up because the intelligence community, on a positive sense, brought in a guy who was very strong, who was trained by Marcus Wolf and by Andropov, guys that I worked with and knew.
So you're talking about Putin being put in. Would you say that the intelligence community in the U.S. had something to do with that?
I would say very strongly that they have. I think it was a very positive move. The intelligence community was very much a part, collectively, along with my initiatives at the Rand Corporation, others who were specialists in the Soviet Union, from the CIA and military intelligence, had the ability to take down the Soviet Union systematically without any war. And I think that's something that both Reagan and Bush Sr. in particular and Baker should be very proud of, and the Americans should be proud of, because this was an example where we had regime change without the use of military forces, without the fact that I know Charlie Wilson's war was emphasized as the pièce de résistance for the CIA, but the takedown of the Soviet Union was far more sophisticated. It involved national character. It involved economics. It involved the use and manipulation of the KGB and many other variables which was not relevant to war, but to financial areas. In turn, what happened is when you bring down a regime, it takes some time, but at the same time you have to think of what will follow the takedown of the regime. What you don't want is a power vacuum. In that power vacuum, you don't want a totalitarian leader to evolve. Having said that, what happened was the KGB entities became oligarchs and, in fact, became corrupt oligarchs. So every one of the institutions or factories in the United States that was run through the Central Committee became fractionated, hybridized, and cannibalized by the KGB. They took it over, And in fact, there was no central control. Gorbachev, it turned out, the minute we put him in and we thought he was capable of handling a very, very multivariate country with many different elements and ethnic groups. And remember, the Soviet Union consisted of 122 different countries and ethnicities. Gorbachev had failed. Then Yeltsin came in. I had left by that time, but I was still involved in the issue of, well, what will and who will manage the Soviet Union and Russia. The Russian Federation, in and of itself, is 11 time zones, so it's pretty big. Yeltsin turned out to be an alcoholic. Whether that was a misreading on behalf of our intelligence community or not, it was one of those elements that came out and had to be rectified very quickly. Within the ranks of the intelligence community in the Soviet Union or in Russia was a young man, ironically, trained first in East Germany. And who was he trained by? He was trained by someone who I had known and had encountered through a proxy, a man by the name of Marcus Wolf. Many of your listeners will know Marcus Wolf by the key player in the movie The Spy Who Came In from the Cold by Jean-Luc Carré. Mm-hmm. Marcus Wolf was a very special spy master, perhaps the greatest spy master of all, who ran over 100,000 East German Stasi operatives, S-T-A-S-S-I, operatives all over East Germany and the world. He had penetrated the BND, or the West German intelligence, and some of our own intelligence. He was so brilliant that by the time we were able to amalgamate or integrate East Germany with West Germany, we could not arrest Marcus Wolf because it would serve no purpose. Instead, he allowed his family to flee overseas, and we allowed him to become a cook. In that process, a very young man who worked for the East German intelligence eventually transitioned into the FSB or the KGB, and his name was Putin, Vladimir Putin. So he was identified very early on in our intelligence community as someone who was very pure Russian meaning not from Moscow but from Leningrad, and whose grandfather, by the way, was a cook, not only for Tsar Alexander but also for Stalin, and was very well entrenched in what we call the nationalist character of Russia. So he was trained not only by Marcus Wolf of East Germany, but by someone I had to work against, Andropov, the KGB, who was also a brilliant spy master. So eventually it was understood in the intelligence community that Putin would have to be the reigning ruler of the new Russian Federation, which we had taken down through the Soviet system, and he would have to accrue power by becoming totalitarian and really Russian in nature. And he was true to form. He basically consolidated the power. He consolidated all the oligarchs. He made sure that the oligarchs were in no way involved in political chicanery in Moscow. And in turn, they all received billions of dollars of corrupt political cronyism types of businesses, Gazprom, as well as construction companies, as well as all types of different industries that they were not attuned to or they were capable of running, but instead that was their political payoff on one condition, that these oligarchs never get involved in politics with Putin. Putin was true to form. And I think the success of the Sochi Olympics is the ultimate point of showing how a totalitarian leader, using his skills, using his background, is able to consolidate a huge country like Russia into a spectacular phenomenon in the midst of a terrorist scenario. So Putin has to be given credit, but at the same time he arose because of the needs and concerns of the American and European intelligence branches. As a result, Putin really worked in collaboration with the CIA and our military intelligence to allow us to transit through Russia into Afghanistan. And we paid him a lot of money to transit into Afghanistan. And that money, in turn, he allowed us to be able to put over spies or alleged spies like Snowden.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Pieczenik. If it's in the U.S.'s interest to have one person to deal with in that area, to have a consolidated Russia, and Putin was the guy that they identified as doing that, give me your take on what's going on now in the Ukraine, where it appears that the EU and the U.S. are trying to undermine Putin. Is that your take on this, or?
Well, Ukraine has always had a history of what I call divided loyalties. Western Ukraine has always been part and parcel of Poland. After World War I, and historically, the Ukraine was never really part of its own national character. It had a certain cultural determinant, but never a geographical determinant. After World War I, Western Ukraine was part of Poland. It fought Poland and wanted to be part of Eastern Ukraine, which was also part of Russia. So you have the Eastern Ukraine, which is Russian, and the Western Ukraine. But the real issue in the Ukraine right now is not democracy versus the EU or Russia versus the United States. What it really is the Ukraine has no more money. And because of the corruption that occurred and because of our failure in the Orange Revolution about 10 years ago, and I don't fault us for that, it just turned out not to be as successful as we thought it was, meaning that we were able to bring a liberal democracy in there, but in turn Putin was able to reverse it. The real issue at hand is about $15 billion worth of debt that has to be serviced and that the EU is not willing to put up, neither is America, and that Putin said to the Ukrainian president, Pieczenik, look, I will collect all your debts, but in turn, I will give you cheaper oil, but you must maintain the integrity of my oil pipelines into Europe. That's the real issue at hand. What happened with Assistant Secretary Nuland, this woman who said, Akfe Ufe to Europe, was nothing more than a very childish, impish attempt on an open phone to show the world that America was involved in really having strategy and in being involved in an aggressive anti-Russian campaign. The reality is quite different. We're not very effective.
So in your opinion, her statement made on an open phone was really sending a message to the world.
It was sending a message, but it was childish. It was inappropriate, and it was not consistent with our ability to maintain a diplomatic presence and at the same time manipulate the parties involved. She is not, I believe, Korea Foreign Service, although she states she's Korean Foreign Service. But her background, her actions belie that, and it seems to me that she may belong to another part of our government. I don't want to announce which part, but she had been Vice President Cheney's chief of staff, along with many other neocons, and her husband, Mr. Kagan, is a famous neocon. So I think she went off on her own as the Assistant Secretary for Europe and really belied any sense of strategy and tactics. You do not allow yourself to be compromised that way or even send a signal that way. It's gauche, it's childish, and the Russians will handle you with counterforce. So I felt that it was totally inappropriate. I think John Kerry, if he's an effective Secretary of State, and I'm not sure he is, he should dismiss her and fire her. But that's my personal opinion and professional.
I thought it was pretty amazing, the reaction from the White House chief spokesman, Jay Carney, says it's something about Russia. It says something about Russia that they would tap a telephone call. I mean, the insanity of that. It's like you can hear the entire world laughing that they would make a statement like that. We'll have the conclusion of that interview tomorrow night on the InfoWars Nightly News. It's a perspective from someone who's spent decades in the intelligence community. Don't miss it. Join us at 7 Central, 8 p.m. Eastern. Well, tonight we have the conclusion of our interview with Dr. Steve Pieczenik, someone who has served at very high levels in the intelligence community over 5 U.S. administrations. He talks about a wide variety of subjects from Putin to the Ukraine to the Snowden documents and the real threat that the military-industrial complex, especially the intelligence community, poses to America. Let's talk a little bit about Ed Snowden and the documents that are there. You think he's something other than a straight-up whistleblower. Tell us exactly what you think is going on, who the players are, and what their goals are.
Well, I will tell you very simply. I started to think of Snowden a long time ago. As I was saying, I thought he was, and analyzing him not as an American, but as a counterintelligence operative or somebody who's had experience in counterintelligence, I thought Snowden was very much what I call the manufactured avatar of the American intelligence community. And what do I mean by that? I started looking at tapes of Edward Snowden when he was giving these bombastic interviews, self-aggrandizing interviews to the German press and other presses. But in the recent press, in a recent interview, he very clearly stated to the Germans, yes, I was in the special forces, but I broke my ankle. Now, that was not credible to me, because if you're in the special forces, you don't just break your ankle and you don't leave. But he went on to explain that the special forces was something that was a noble endeavor on his part, and he saw it as a magnifier of military power. In other words, he gave me an explanation that was inconsistent with being a subcontractor. Mm-hmm. Then he went on to really indict himself by saying in the interview, I'm a CIA operative. I was recruited by the CIA and then the NSA. So what I'm getting at very quickly was, Snowden is very typical of what we in the intelligence community would want to do, and that is to create an avatar or an image of a person who may be a traitor or a whistleblower, so that we allow the American public to play off either part of two figures that the intelligence community creates. On the one hand, the intelligence community creates this incredible massive surveillance, where at the same time they want to make sure that they are not acquitted, that they're not judged harshly, so that they make sure they can control the narrative. So they create somebody like Snowden, or in the case that I was talking about as well, is Ellsberg, who also had a similar history, where he was involved in the Vietnam War, was a CIA operative on the State Department cover for a general who was called the Quiet American, and he then went out and revealed the Pentagon Papers from Rand Corporation. I subsequently went to the Rand Corporation, and there where do I find, what's his name? I find Ellsberg. I find him at the MIT Center, where I'm trained. And everyone there, except for myself, is trained to go into the CIA. So I realized the CIA was really nurturing and initiated a lot of Ellsberg's Pentagon Papers. At the same time, they kept him safe at MIT. And very similar to the Snowden affair. Now, why would Snowden attack James Clapper and attack General Keith Alexander, the NSA chief? The reason was there's an initial tension throughout the past 30 years between our civilian intelligence, which is only 1/15 of the major intelligence bureaus that we have. We have 16 major intelligence units. 15 of them are in the military, and the 16th one is the CIA, a civilian one. For 30 years, there's always been this inherent tension. However, there is what we call the IC, the intelligence community, which at times gets together and decides, look, we have to have a common interest. The common interest now is that we made a mistake in Iraq. We went into Afghanistan. That's a mistake. We have to have a diversion, and as a diversion, we have people like James Clapper, where we created this office at DNI, Director of National Intelligence, which is absolutely absurd. This was an unnecessary organization that was created out of a false flag and a stand-down that we've talked about before with Alex Jones after 9/11. James Clapper is a decent man. He came in. He was from the Air Force. He was military. Keith Alexander created the NSA. But in turn, the entire intelligence community said, look, we're still going to control the narrative of everything that occurred from 9/11 to stand down to Afghanistan to Iraq by creating a good guy who can be seen as a good guy, a whistleblower, or a traitor. And as long as we can create that narrative, we are really in control of the game. And that's where the American people have been had. Now, why would they control a game, and what's the game? Mm-hmm. The game is about $60 billion worth of subcontracting from the Pentagon to companies, at least $6 billion going to Booz Allen. Now, who is Booz Allen? Booz Allen is a consulting firm that I knew in Bethesda that was totally ineffective, controlled by John Michael McConnell, who was former military DCI and vice chairman and was in the head of the NSA, who was closely tied to another man, John Brennan of the CIA, who controls that now, who was also involved with James Woolsey, who was director of the CIA, and James Clapper, all of whom belonged to Booz Allen. So you have this game going on where Snowden, in an apparently bizarre story, reveals all these millions of secrets, which we don't really know about, but some of it is somewhat revealing to somebody. And it says that we, the United States, have been monitored. So what? We've been monitored since the 50s, and Google and Amazon and all the rest of these private companies have been monitoring us more effectively than NSA. And Snowden goes to Hong Kong, which is not a real safe place, and then ostensibly goes to Russia, where Putin takes care of him. Well, I said to you, Putin has been really an ally. He's taken care of all the people who we don't want to have as the leaders of a country, and he takes care of our transit points into Afghanistan. But in the meanwhile, who are the people involved? We have John Brennan of the CIA, which Snowden doesn't say a word about. And he admits readily, I'm a CIA operative. Yet he destroys some CIA assets. But in the meantime, really the game goes on. Then he talks about Booz Allen, but he really doesn't go into detail how Booz Allen has taken a $6 billion contract and then enhanced it in conjunction with other intelligence contracts from the Pentagon up to $60 billion. And the American public, that's you and I, are paying for an intelligence that's not worth anything. On the same time, not only is the game played out between Snowden being a spy or a whistleblower, but at the meantime, there's a notion from Keith Alexander and James Clapper in these meetings in front of Congress, which are disingenuous meetings, that we have a clear and present danger. Well, we don't have a clear and present danger. We don't have terrorists who we've picked up and protected us from these massive explosions. This whole terrorist nonsense has been created by Cheney, Bush, Kagan, Nuland, the whole group of neocons, in order to justify our presence and an expansion into the Middle East, which has failed dramatically. And so what's happened in return is we've created this monstrosity of an intelligence community, which is neither intelligent nor an effective community, but is sucking out the very lifeline of our country. And I say that as an American citizen, not as an intelligence operative who's overseeing these guys. From an intelligence point of view, I've told them repeatedly, I would have fired every one of them. I would have knocked out every one of these 16 agencies because they stovepipe. And now we're going to have a new leader of the NSA, Mike Rogers, an admiral, who really doesn't know anything about this. He's not even the equivalent intellectually or in terms of experience of a Keith Alexander, who was head of MI, Military Intelligence, G2, and is significantly smarter. Whatever mishaps Keith Alexander's done was done in the process of building up massive surveillance, which we didn't necessarily need, but will not be effective. So in the process of all of this going on, we do not have an oversight committee. Dianne Feinstein is an antiquated, God only knows, a disaster of a woman, of a legislator. We have Nancy Pelosi. We have Mike Rogers. We have all these nonsensical representatives on the Democrat and Republican side who really are beholden to the intelligence community because their communities have intelligence contracts through Booz Allen or L3.
They're sycophants. Let me ask you this, Dr. Pieczenik. Now, we've got the civilian versus the military side of the intelligence community, as you pointed out. You've talked about that kind of internecine fighting going on as being the roots of Benghazi. But are they just incompetent when they put these Snowden documents out because they've really have, public opinion is not really of a mind to give them a blank check right now, even though it seems like they're getting everyone more or less adjusted to the new way of thinking about the government, that they're going to monitor everything that we have. And we've got this discussion going on as to whether there is going to be anything such as privacy. So is this a limited hangout, or is this internecine warfare, or are they trying to build up the intelligence community but just doing it in a ham-fisted, incompetent way that they're really losing public opinion on this?
I think the latter is probably the best way. You've explained it very well. I think it's a hand-fisted, incompetent way. As I said in the blog, and we've just talked about it, the Army has really gone off on its own. It's built its own capacity and capability to invade absolutely nothing and to be able to really get into no combat whatsoever. But irrespective of that, the Army has become a Centurion Army or an Imperial Army, which is not beholden to the United States. In the same nature, we have a very heavy-handed intelligence community which is not effective at all. Our human is not effective. Our ELINT is not effective. Our capacity to do massive surveillance is really not effective. We have not picked up any terrorists. All we do is really to counter-effect what's called industrial espionage. But it's not relevant to our livelihood. Our private companies are far more effective, and they move more quickly than the NSA could, or even our whole government could, as most people realize. But what they care about the most, the intelligence and the military community, is their own perpetuation as an entity. They don't give a damn really about what Americans have to say or American civilians. What they care about is that the legislators and the representatives, remember, we're in a republic, not a democracy, that they allocate the amount of monies that are required to maintain a minimal standing force in the military and a massive presence of intelligence, which is not really effectively intelligence. So you have this added burden. They've literally added a second appendix to a body. Literally, you don't need the DNI. That came out after 9/11. Well, 9/11 was a stand-down. So when you look at it, we created our own. We don't need an integrated unit that then integrates other integrated units, which never become integrated. It's kind of a Alice in Wonderland phenomenon, and they don't care what the Americans say because they know that the legislators will keep on talking about clear and present dangers.
Yeah, I find it interesting that Glenn Greenwald said that the most sensational things he was holding for his soon-to-be-released book, his movie, and the media empire that he's creating with one of the world's wealthiest billionaires, Pierre Omidyar. What do you think is going to come of that? Is that something that's really going to change public opinion, or is the public just too dumb and too numb to do anything about it?
I don't think the public is dumb. I think the American people have been clearly underestimated. I think they're inured to the whole thing. I said from day one to some of my friends that nobody really cares about Snowden and nobody cares about Greenwald. And just what you said was right on the button. That is, Greenwald, whoever he may be or not be, his interest is the same as the interest of the intelligence community, which is to create money, create notoriety, and perpetuate his own narcissism. No one in the United States or the world really will care very much. As you see, there's a movie about Julian Assange, WikiLeaks. Nobody even sees it. Nobody really cares. And the notion that we're being monitored is kind of passé. Everybody who deals with the Internet, anybody who deals with iPads or iPhones, they know almost automatically that this is a new era. This is an era which is not going to have sensationalism as it's portrayed. And in many ways, the intelligence community, the military community, really didn't understand the American mentality of saying, so what? Or as my daughter would say, whatever. So what? And it's no big thing. The only thing I'm saying that's major about this is that you can't continue this falderall, this nonsense, at the cost of $80 billion a year.
Yes.
We have that need for that money for too many other things.
Yes, the military-industrial complex is bankrupting us, and the concerns I think that everybody has is that it's not only, it's been on foreign wars for the longest time, and now it's turning inwardly, domestically, militarizing the police and doing espionage on American citizens instead of on foreign governments. Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Pieczenik. We're out of time, but it's been a fascinating...
Well, it's a pleasure, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Well, Eisenhower warned us a long time ago about the military-industrial complex. Dr. Pieczenik is warning us about the threat that it poses. And of course, the intelligence community is just the omniscient part of Omnicorps, as RoboCop would put it.
So I go back to the warnings of George Washington, who said, be careful of the tyranny of the White House and the presidency. And then I go back to the statements of Thomas Jefferson, that in every democracy, we must fight for our own freedoms. Thank you. Good luck. Good night.